We didn't have the sophisticated inertial starters like they use today, and they didn't start the cars. The two cars would get pushed out onto the track and turn around and come back with starting the engines, and they'd make this big U-turn right at the starting line. It was kind of a performance, act that people liked.
In the early 60s, there was one owner-driver team that started to emerge as the one to beat at Minnesota dragways and other drag strips around the country. The owner was the Big Wheel Auto Store. The car was the AAGD gas dragster maintained and tuned by Arvy Mack, and the driver was Bruce Stormin Norman.
Well, in those days, we would go over to the Big Wheel to see what was happening, because that was the place to be. They were the center point of most of the racing in the Twin Cities area. And when we heard he had a dragster, we all went out to Minnesota to watch it. And he was kind of our hero because he was the first dragster. We had a lot of cars that were rails, but they were actually automotive rails. He was the first actually dragster-built rail that ran out there, and he was kind of our hero.
Nobody really knew about drag racing up here, much about it. The only thing we knew was the West Coast and all the cool cars that they were building out there. And then all of a sudden, Arvy Mack from the Big Wheel, who had money, built a cool dragster. And that was the first one we had in this area that was competitive.
It was like, oh man, this is it. That instantly made me a dragster guy.
Arvy was the one that led to all my trouble. I bought my first parts from Arvy at the Big Wheel because I lived in South Minneapolis, and the Big Wheel was in South Minneapolis. The first year of the Nationals in Detroit, I took my 57 Chev to Detroit. But in '59, I left at home, and I went with Arvy Mack and the Big Wheel crew and helped crew the car for him there. And so you can kind of say Arvy's the guy that got me going on it all.
The first local driver that really made a name was the Big Wheel.
One of the very first real professional guys that came out of this area. And Arvy did very well. And consequently, a lot of the big name racers came up here to beat Arvy and the Big Wheel.
In the week before the Nationals, a cluster of California guys on the way to Detroit came to Minnesota dragways, primarily the Dragmaster guys, but they brought 4 cars. And they came back to Minnesota, and the Sunday event rained out, so we got together at the track on Tuesday night. And that night, the Big Wheel set a national record for speed, 176 miles an hour plus a little. And the West Coast guys didn't believe it.
They'd have match races like we'd match raced a couple times with Bud Don and John out of Chicago, and we always beat them. But it was a good attraction, and we were good friends with them. Even if you beat them, we were friends. And we raced Tommy Ivo at several drag strips around, and I think we beat him too, even when he had that twin Buick car. And we were good friends with Tommy Ivo. So we weren't always the ones that they featured. They'd have the Garlets come up maybe, or somebody else to race against somebody else. But the fact that the Big Wheel was running so good and they knew that we'd be there every Sunday, pulled a lot of people out there because they didn't have any cars going as fast as we were going for a long time. Lake Street, after they took the streetcar tracks out of there, trolleys quit running on Lake Street, and Lake Street became the local drag strip. And there was cars racing down Lake Street. Well, it was a lot of racing all over the place, and people didn't like it, and there was a need to have a drag strip where people could go, kids that wanted to race and that wanted to do performance, to work on their cars, could go and do it safely and not interfere with other people. I think that John Foster, if I remember correctly, I might be wrong, but I think he was instrumental in getting the group going. And it was a group of people that were interested in cars and performance, and they had a car show every year. And John wanted to get a drag strip going. The only drag strip, the closest one, was Minnesota, Twin City Speedways, and then the next one was down in Des Moines. And John somehow talked the Optimist Club into backing the construction and raising the funds to build Minnesota Dragways. They spent, I don't know, a couple of years building it and developing it and raising the money to build the drag strip. And I give John, the credit for getting this thing done. It was a tough track at that time because they had really just finished it, and it was seal coated and had all kinds of sand on top of the seal coating. So anybody that was trying to get any kind of traction at all didn't. And it was a mess. And it took, I think maybe 3-4 months before that track really became to the point where you could, you weren't getting all that sand in your face from the seal coating. So it actually turned out to be a pretty good surface after that. Well, there was a lot of stock cars, and then there was people that would build a car out of an old Ford chassis. Most of the guys that built race cars in those days, they were just guys scrounging for money, working jobs, and nothing like today. There was only a couple of professional racers out there, a couple of guys like Don Garlitz, Chris Karamessinis, who commanded some kind of show-up money to go to a different drag strip. Everybody else did it because they loved it.
Ron Johnson had a big part to do with the growth of Minnesota Dragways. He first started out as a photographer out there, and he hung around with the guys over at the Big Wheel, and he traveled with them, and he met Karamessinis and the guys out even out in the West Coast. And I'm pretty darn sure he's the guy that made the connection to bring the big name guys up here. In fact, I know for a fact that was right. And they wanted to come up not only to test the cars up there, but to build, to go out there and beat the Big Wheel car. They had a reputation with that car, and the Chicago boys would come up. They came from all over, and drag racing really was a hotbed up here in Minnesota back in the early '60s.
It seems like they always had a poster at the Big Wheel store on Larpenteur and White Bear Avenue. Or you'd listen to KDWB or WDGY, and John would put some advertisements on that.
Rod Stuckey was a guy from Kansas City. There was another fellow named Lou Cangelosi. There was Bud, Don, and John, who were from Chicago. Chris Karamessinis was from Chicago. There was Garlitz was there. Then when Garlitz wasn't driving, Art Malone was there driving Garlitz's car. At the Big Wheel store, when the big guys were in town, they were all down on, cars were all brought down our shop where they were working on their engines. And what was really special about it was how much more advanced the cars were getting. They were when it first started in 1959, there really wasn't much in the way of equipment. But by 1960, 61, people were starting to build engines that they were buying equipment. They were being able to get better tires, slicks, and you could buy the fuel injection stuff was starting to become a little more advanced. Of course, Hilborn had been in it for years, and then Enderley came along, and if you go back to the first time Garlitz raced up there, they were running 8 carburetors. They had nobody was using superchargers. But by 1961, 61, this had all changed, and had started to become more sophisticated and more just specialized towards drag racing.
Well, the early 60s, that's how I got started on nitro. We had match races up here on the nitro cars. I think they had a couple guys hired in, like Bob Sullivan and a couple guys, Malone or somebody, and Arvy Mack was out there one day, and I says, let's try this car in nitromethane, because I could see how good those guys were going, and that's what got me hooked. We had leather jackets those days, and we changed a quick change gear in the back of the Dragmaster chassis I had, and guess what jet to put in the injector, and we ran them like 25%. I borrowed the fuel or bought it from Bob Sullivan. And the darn car at that time went like a 8 seconds flat, 198 miles an hour. I said, well, at that time we were racing gasoline-powered cars. And from that weekend on, it started my nitro career.